Tonight we have Obadiah. Obadiah. I thought, since it's so short, it's 21 verses, we just read it. Why not? And then we'll look at it. So I'm reading from the LSB. So Obadiah, there's only one chapter. So, verse 1. The vision of Obadiah. Thus says Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. We have heard a report from Yahweh, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us arise against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. The arrogance of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the cliff, in the height of your habitation, who says in his heart, Who will bring me down to earth? Though you build loftily like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares Yahweh. If thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you would be ruined. Would they not thieve only until they had enough? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not allow some gleanings to remain? Oh, how Esau will be searched out and his hidden treasures ransacked. All the men who have a covenant with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There is no discernment in him. Will I not on that day, declares Yahweh, cause the wise men to perish from Edom, and discernment from the mountain of Esau? Then your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that each one may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers took his wealth captive, and foreigners entered his gate, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. Now, do not look on your brother's day with triumph, the day of his misfortune, and do not be glad over the sons of Judah in the day when they perish. And do not let your mouth speak great things in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Indeed, you do not look on their calamity with triumph in the day of their disaster. Do not send out for their wealth in the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down those among them who escape, and do not deliver over their survivors in the day of their distress. For the day of Yahweh draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you all drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow, and they will be as if they never were. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy. And the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau will be as stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for Yahweh has spoken. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, and they will possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this military force of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem, who are in Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. And the saviors will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will belong to Yahweh. All right, Obadiah. Well, in the Tim Burton Batman movie in 1989, starring Michael Keaton and Kim Basinger, Michael Keaton plays Batman, or Bruce Wayne, his alter ego, and it's an interesting movie, but there's a scene in there where he's at his massive mansion, Wayne Manor, and he's has this love interest with Vicky Vale, the female actress, and he has her over for dinner, and they're eating in this room that is absolutely massive in his mansion. And it's this incredibly long rectangular table, and Bruce Wayne is sitting on one end of the table, and Vicky Vale sitting on the end, and they're trying to have a date and talk to each other, and they keep having to yell across the room. And she says at one point, "Can you pass the salt?" And he says, "What?" And she says, can you pass the salt? And then he gets the salt and he walks all the way down and he hands her the salt. And then she asks him, do you like eating in this room? And he says to her, almost like he's about to say, yeah, I do. And then he thinks, come to think of it, I don't think I've ever been in this room. And it's just the humor of how wealthy Bruce Wayne is, that he has such a massive mansion that there could be a room that big in his house that he doesn't think he's actually ever been in before. Well, the Bible is sort of like a mansion of sorts with many different rooms in it. Some rooms are bigger, some rooms are smaller. And I think there are some Christians who might be able to say, along with Bruce Wayne, about the book of Obadiah, come to think of it, I don't think I've ever been in this room before. I don't think I've ever read this book before. It is, maybe to keep the illustration, the closet of the Old Testament. It is the shortest book of the Old Testament. It is an Old Testament postcard, we might say. You could fit it on a postcard. And yet, despite its brevity, not a lot of people give it much attention. We've mentioned another illustration in our studies that some books are like hub airports, like Hartsfield Jackson, Atlanta. I mean, you get almost everywhere from that airport. All these places go in there, and they also go out from there. And so are some books of the Bible. They have so much theology prior from other books coming into it, and then a lot of theology going out to lots of other books in the future. So books like Deuteronomy is really big in that regard. Psalms is really big in that regard. Isaiah is really big in that regard. But then you have other books that are very important and vital, but they are more like a regional airport. They're like Valdosta Airport. And I think Obadiah, we might say, is like Valdosta Airport. It's actually really significant, but it's just small, and it makes connections to other places, which gets you to the other destinations. You need more to fill in the gaps. All right, one more illustration. When they were making all these Marvel movies, they made the Captain American movie, and they called it The First Avenger. Well, I think in some ways you could call Obadiah the first prophet, not of all time, because you might think of some very early characters in the Bible who have a prophetic role. But when it comes to these writing prophets, Obadiah is likely, at least among the minor prophets, there's a good argument to be made that he's the first one to write. And so his definition, for example, of the day of the Lord becomes definitional for the other prophets, like Joel, who spends a lot of his time talking about the day of the Lord, but I think he's probably building upon the work of Obadiah. So Obadiah is really definitional, foundational, and it just makes sense that you would expand on something, from smaller to bigger, right? And so you've got this really short prophet, not like in stature, but in length, and he gives this prophecy, and other prophets, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12, or the 11, I guess, would build upon that. The book has been described this way. This is a helpful tagline I was given in seminary, I think, that stuck with me to remember the essence of the book of Obadiah. It is about a bitter battle between brothers. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. A bitter battle between brothers. And those brothers are Jacob and Esau, yeah. And the nations that they represent, Israel and Edom. Edom is the nation that came from Esau, Jacob's brother, and of course, more easily to discern, Israel comes from Jacob. So that's what we have in the book. An ancient rivalry, Edom and Israel, all the way from within the womb. So they're fighting inside, and they find out there's two nations warring within you, in your womb. And they come out, and there's that, of course, Genesis 25, you get the recounting of Jacob tricks his brother to steal the birthright, or take the birthright, I guess, through agreement by Esau to get some red stew, and he's the red-headed guy. He's the carrot top, Esau is. And so Edom means like red, and so there's where you get the name for them. You also have some other historical battles between them, or issues. In Numbers 20, when Israel's trying to pass through the land of Edom, like, hey, let us just pass through. We won't touch anything. They say, they do the old Gandalf, like, you shall not pass. You can't come through here. You guys are... And so they reject their, request. Interestingly enough, in Numbers 24:18, Balaam makes a prophecy about how Edom and one of their major cities will be destroyed, and Israel will be victorious. So you have this major conflict. We might liken it to, as one preacher did, the battle between the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's kind of like that. You've got the Edom and Israel. It's a long-standing battle that began with a pig, I think, in the case of the Hatfields and McCoys, and it just ballooned from there. So that's what you have in this book. And it's also, zooming out from Obadiah, just this story of Jacob and Esau becomes a really interesting picture of God's electing love. You have two brothers in the womb. One God chooses to the younger, the older will serve the younger, and you have God's electing love, according to Paul in Romans 9, that he chooses one and not the other, and it shows God's favor upon Israel over Edom, and how that will play out in history. So, one of the things that's really helpful to keep in mind, another passage to help you understand what's going on in Obadiah, is the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, and specifically the promise at the end of the Abrahamic covenant, that first giving of it in chapter 12, verse 3, it says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you," speaking of Israel. So those who bless Israel, God will bless them. Those who curse Israel, he will curse. And this is an example that comes up with Edom, where because of their opposition to Israel and what they do to Israel, God is going to judge them as a result of that, because of the covenant he has with them. However, what seems to be happening in Obadiah is that there was some historical event that happened where, probably in the 800s, where Edom joined in with the Philistines in attacking, and another nation in attacking Israel, and had some victory in that. And so the question in the Israelites' mind is, hey, how can this be possible? Isn't God for us? Isn't God, what about those who curse us like this? Like, especially Edom. I mean, it was told that the older will serve the younger. So how is it that they can get away with this, God? And so the book of Obadiah, although it is directed towards Edom, whether they got it or not, we don't know, that it's really for the comfort of Israel to say, hey, God is going to punish your enemies. God will not forget. And so it's the comfort of God's judgment and vengeance upon the enemies of God's people. That's like the really big theological message. And so we could tie that in to say, like, vengeance is mine, I will repay. We can leave it to the Lord to get all the bad guys in the end, so to speak. So this is a book about Edom's judgment. Edom's judgment. So God will bring judgment on those who curse Israel and ensure they possess the land promised to them and the kingdom. But what we'll see is that Obadiah is not just talking about Edom and Israel, but Edom as a representative of really all of the nations of the whole world. In fact, even early on, he references nations twice in verse 1 and 2. And then he'll talk about the nations in verse 15 when he kind of expands out to talk about the ultimate day of the Lord that's coming. So how to read this is, in the beginning of the book, the letter, you have what God is going to do to Edom because of their opposition to Israel and God's people, which becomes an example or a harbinger or a microcosm of what he's going to do to every other nation who opposes him and opposes his people, if that makes sense. So that's why he expands out. So it's like, here's one example of a nation, Edom, who go against my people and I judge them. Let's expand that out to all the nations who do this in the end of time, the end of history, and what I will do to them to bring in the kingdom. That's kind of what the logic of the book is. So the book gives you comfort that God will bring justice in his judgment. And so you can trust God to bring judgment on the wicked, though they seem to be presently secure. A couple other things before we jump in a little bit more. Obadiah's name means servant of Yahweh. And it's a title that a lot of different Old Testament figures have. They're often revelation bringers. They move God's plan along. He writes early, sometime probably in the mid-800s BC. So if you just put some markers out there, you've got 722 BC, the northern kingdom is taken into captivity by the Assyrians. 586, Babylon comes and destroys the temple in Jerusalem and takes the southern kingdom captive. and so on and so forth. So this is like a good bit before that, in the mid 800s. The Edomites live in Seir, which is also known as Petra, and it is on the southeast of the Dead Sea. So if you've got the picture of Israel, like Richie had up this morning, you've got the Mediterranean Seas over here, you've got the desert over here, you've got Israel right here, and you've got Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River comes down, then you've got the Dead Sea right here. If Jerusalem is right here, Edom is over here. Okay, so there you go. There's your quick overview. Sorry for those on the recording. Got to figure it out yourself. So that's where the Edomites live. And if you've ever seen Indiana Jones, right? Which movie is it? Is it Raiders? Maybe it's, I think it's Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they go to Petra. And it's that city built into the rock. I mean, so that's the area where we're talking about with Edom. So
there's nothing back there, by the way.
There's what?
I mean, it's just a facade. You can walk in about, I don't know, from me to Mike, as far as...
Really? That's funny. Kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So there's prophecies of Edom elsewhere in other prophets when they preach against the nations. But here's really an early prophecy against them. So, main idea, God's judgment on his people's enemies leading to the kingdom. One of the key words in the book is day, the day. So the day of Edom in the beginning of the book, and the day of the Lord in the second part of the book. So that's what you have. Really, maybe you could say the day of Edom in verses 1 to 14, and the day of the Lord in verses 15 to 21. So that's what we got. I got an outline here, but just pause for a second. See, is that kind of, how's that orientation? Any questions, just as we've read the book one time, kind of give some of that overview. Any initial questions? Clarify anything before we move through an outline? All right, 10:4. You could break the book down, yes, in two parts, but I think you could break it down as well in three different sections here. The first section is in verses 1 to 9, and we're going to call that the certainty of judgment. And then verses 10 to 14, the cause of judgment. Like, why is God going to bring judgment? And notice just verse 10, because, right? So you see a transition there. Here's why. Because you did this, I'm going to do that. So that's what you have there. So you have the certainty of judgment, 1 to 9, the cause of judgment, 10 to 14, and then the comforts of judgment in verses 15 to 21. So that's what we'll use as our roadmap for walking through the book.
What was the third one? The
comforts of judgment. So, backing up, certainty of judgment, 1 to 9, verses 1 to 9. Verses 1 and 2 kind of orient us to the prophecy, the vision, it says, that Obadiah receives. So verses 1 and 2 are really kind of the announcement of judgment. It says the vision of Obadiah. Vision is a form of revelation from God, God's disclosure to Obadiah. So this is a divine message. And so anything God says is certain to happen. This is a certain outcome. There's a summons given in verse 1. Thus says Lord Yahweh. This is the king talking concerning Edom. We have heard a report from Yahweh. That we is probably a reference to Israel, like an editorial we. We have heard a report from Yahweh, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us arise against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. So we've got two times that nations are mentioned in verses 1 and 2. So that tells us, okay, this is not just about Edom and Israel, but it's about other nations as well. Then there's really an interesting interplay here between human intention and divine intention in verses 1 and 2. Notice at the end of verse 1, it says, Arise, and let us arise against her for battle. So this is like the nations who are saying this against Edom. So this is the human intention of these nations to attack Edom. Then you have God's intention in verse 2. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. This is God's intention. So that often happens. Daniel 1:1-2 starts that way, where you've got the plans of Babylon, and then you've got God's plans, which are really working in tandem, but they have different intentions. So this is really the general announcement of judgment against Edom. And then what you have really in verses 3-9 are God's pronouncement of this certain judgment, and it really seems to follow three areas that they prize themselves on. Their city was impenetrable, and they had great security in where they lived because they lived high up in the rock, and it was really hard to get to them. And so they had a great city. They had the upper hand, the high ground. The second thing about them was they had lots of wealth, because where the city was located was on what's called the King's Highway. So a lot of commerce passes through there, and they just make a lot of money through that. So they've got a secure city, they've got a lot of money, and then also they were known for their wisdom as well. And so essentially what God is going to do is say, this judgment is certain, and I'm going to just touch on each one of those things. I'm going to destroy each one of those. I'm going to destroy your city that is so impenetrable. I'm going to take your wealth, and I'm going to destroy your men of wisdom. And so that's what we're going to see one by one. So first, he takes away their security, which they pride themselves in verses 3 and 4. So the arrogance of your heart has deceived you. And so they're really proud about this. They're this is their security, and yet they're deceived in their arrogance. You who dwell in the clefts of the cliff, in the height of your habitation, who says in his heart, who will bring me down to earth? So this is Seir, this is Petra, and it's this impregnable, inaccessible city. He says, though you build loftily like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares Yahweh. So God is saying, hey, I'm going to take you guys out. I'm going to take you. It doesn't matter how well fortified your city is. This is inescapable. It was a hard to gain access to city. They had a military advantage. Here's how one writer, Barry Beetzel, in the Moody Atlas of Bible Lands, describes their city. He says, quote, the gigantic cliffs and steep gorges of Edom, even from the more gentle slopes of Punk's Pass, it represented an inaccessible objective that at Edomite whim would continue to exist in splendid isolation. Situated adjacent to the western Edomite mountains, about 21 air miles south of Punan, is a cavity-like canyon containing the impressive remains of Petra. The site of Petra was approached through a 1-mile corridor flanked on either side by high perpendicular cliffs that almost touch at a few points. The basin that actually housed Petra was itself surrounded by cliffs of colorful sandstone into which have been carved the structures of tombs of what in antiquity was a city laden with wealth, end quote. So just really impressive city. And God's saying, you might think you're untouchable. You might think you're so secure and you take pride in this, but I'm going to get you. I'm still going to get you, and I'm going to bring you down from your high, lofty place. Like pride sets you up loftily. And he says, I'm going to humble you guys, destroy your city. The second thing he attacks is the next thing that they prize, their riches. And so verse 5, this really shows in verse 5 and 6 the totality of this judgment, how extensive it's going to be, how comprehensive. He says, if thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you will be ruined. Would they not thieve only until they had enough? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not allow some gleanings to remain? Oh, how Esau will be searched out and his hidden treasures ransacked. So we actually have confirmed there that this is talking about Esau, because he calls him Esau. So he calls him Edom in verse 1, and now Esau. So the same idea. So essentially what he's saying is this. Though they're known for their great wealth based on their location, he uses this logic. He says, okay, when a thief comes to your house and breaks in, do they take everything? And the answer is no. A thief doesn't typically take everything. Usually you walk in and your house is all messed up and they left a bunch of stuff. What do? They went for the valuables. But the thief, what kind of thief takes all the light bulbs out, takes all the batteries out of your controllers? What thief takes your trash, rips your carpet up and takes your carpet, takes the baseboards off, your wainscoting, they take everything. And that's what God's saying. He's like, normally thieves don't take everything. But in this case, I'm going to take everything from you, Edom. Or then he says, what about grape gatherers when they come to harvest? Don't they usually leave some gleanings behind? They don't get every last grape. He's like, oh, but not so with you. I'm going to get everything. You guys are going to be laid waste. So this is just extreme language for God to say, though you guys prize yourself on your wealth, I'm going to take it all. I'm going to be like worse than a thief. And so the third thing then that they prized was their wisdom. And so now God's going to go after their wisdom in verses 6 to 9. And so really he says basically how they have these alliances and these other peoples who are friendly with them and how they think that they're on good terms, but those people are going to turn on them. So verse 7, all the men who have a covenant with you, so some kind of alliance, will send you forth to the border. And the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They will eat your bread, will set an ambush for you. There is no discernment in him. Will I not on that day, declares Yahweh, cause the wise men to perish from Edom and discernment from the mountain of Esau? Then your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that each one may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. So in other words, like, hey, you guys thought you're so wise and you had all these alliances and everything, but guess what? Those people are all going to turn on you. I'm going to make them turn on you and slaughter you and destroy you. And your wise men are going to be gone. So God just attacks them at every level. They're a great city. I'm going to tear you down. Their great wealth, I'm going to take it all. And your great wisdom, I'm going to just annihilate it. So this is the certainty of God's judgment for them. So that's the first part. Then he moves to the cause of judgment. Like, why is God going to do this to them? In verses 10 to 14. And verses 10 to 14 give the reasons. Verse 10 begins with the word because. So he's going to explain. So in some ways, Obadiah is kind of easy to follow. You know, he tells them what he's going to do. Then he says why he's going to do it. And then the implications that will have for the future. And here we really see a ramping up of this, the word day. This is Edom's day. This is what they did and will do to Israel. Now, here's how I think you should understand verses 10 to 14. Verses 10 and 11 seem to be talking about a time in Edom's history that they have already done something. Verses 10 and 11 are describing something that's already happened, something they did to Israel already. But verses 12 to 14 are a warning to not do something in the future. Like, don't do this, don't do this. So it seems as though we should view these as separate occasions. Verses 10 and 11 being something that's already happened, verses 12 to 14 something that is a warning to not do something in the future, at least from Obadiah's present perspective. So, does that make sense? All right. What seems to be best to understand, and there's a few different views on this, I'll just let you know, but we're not going to get into all of them. I think this makes the most sense, that verses 10 and 11 describe the past time in Israel's history between 852 and 841 BC, where Israel was attacked by the Philistines and an Arabian coalition, and Jehoram was king. This is described in 2 Chronicles chapter 21. And Edom participated in this in some way. They, while these other nations were attacking Israel and Jerusalem and taking stuff and plundering them, Edom participates. They join in the plundering. And so that seems to be what verses 10 and 11 are talking about. So let me just read it again with that in our minds. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers took his wealth captive, and foreigners entered his gate, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. So he's saying, hey, in the past, remember, you guys joined in the fun, and took and looted, and you were excited that this was happening to your brother, so to speak, your brother nation. But then, in verses 12 to 14, it's as if Obadiah is saying through the Lord, hey, you did that in the past, don't you dare do it again. You did it like that, but don't do it again. And so he has this repetitions of, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And so I think, in retrospect, because the other prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they'll talk about what Edom will do to Israel in 586 BC. So Babylon's going to come in 586, and they're going to attack Jerusalem. And at that point, it's going to be even more devastating because they're going to destroy the temple. And wouldn't you know it, Edom joins in again and does all this stuff. So from our perspective, not only are verses 12 to 14 for us, we can look back and say, oh yeah, Edom did all those things. But when Obadiah is writing, he's saying, hey, this hasn't happened yet, but don't do it. So what do we learn? They didn't heed the warning, right? So from that perspective, listen to what he's warning them not to do, which we know now that they actually did. And we'll highlight some of the things that they did. So the first thing they did was they rejoice over Israel's destruction. But they're told not to do this. Now, do not look on your brother's day with triumph, the day of his misfortune. And do not be glad over the sons of Judah in the day when they perish. And do not let your mouth speak great things in the day of their distress. So now it's like a forward-looking thing. And so he's like, hey, don't gloat over them. Don't be excited when this happens to this party, to your people. Something just fell from the sky. So they rejoiced over Israel's destruction. And then it gets worse. In verse 13, they joined the plundering and looting. Verse 13 says, do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Indeed, you do not look on their calamity with triumph in the day of their disaster, and do not send out for their wealth in the day of their disaster. So it's like, hey, don't you dare join in. Don't go and take their stuff. And then, of course, they gave up those who escaped. And this is really wicked. Verse 14, do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down those among them who escape, and do not deliver over their survivors in the day of their distress. In an attack like this, who would be the survivors? Well, it'd likely be a lot of women and children who are escaping, right? So they go, where can we go for safety? They might go to say, well, here's the brother nation, right? We're not on great terms, but they're family. Let's go to Edom. And so they run there for help and safety and security. And what do? They say, oh yeah, come over here. And then the Babylonians show up and they're like, all right, here you go. And they hand over those who are trying to flee for safety over to the Babylonians. And so, really wicked. They're giving them up to their enemies. It's utter betrayal. And so he's warning them and saying, hey, you acted like this in the past. Don't do it again, Edom. But of course, they do. And so that brings up Genesis 12, verse 3. Those who curse you, I will curse. And so that's what's going to happen. Because of what they have done, they will be destroyed. And so this is the cause of judgment. They went against God's people. In Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8, God warns the nations about attacking his people in this way. In verse 8 it says, for thus says Yahweh of hosts, after glory he has sent me against the nations which have taken you as spoil. For he who touches you, Israel, touches the apple of his eye. He's like, don't touch my eye. God's going to protect that. And so he's like warning the nations here about that. So Edom will serve as an example then and a microcosm of what God is going to do to all the nations who rebel against him and attack his people. So that's the second section. We have the certainty of judgment, 1-9. The cause of judgment, 10-14. Hey, you did this in the past. Don't do it again. Of course, they do. And so what does that trigger? It triggers what God is going to do in the future when he judges nations as a whole in the end times. And this is the comforts of judgment. Following so far? Okay. So verses 15-21 of this final section here, and the comforts of judgment. And I just broke it down into 3 sections here for this final part. This is the culmination, really. And verse 15 is probably the key verse, if not 21. 15 and 21 are really key. The first comfort of judgment is the comfort of vengeance for God's enemies in verses 15 and 16. The comfort of vengeance for God's enemies. So verse 15 says, for the day of Yahweh, so we have the day of Edom, but now we have the day of Yahweh, draws near, and now it's not on Edom, but it's on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Because just as you all drank, so it's like y'all actually, it's a you plural in Hebrew. So just as y'all all drank on my holy mountain, and that's probably referring to Israel, they experienced some level of God's judgment and his wrath when he judges them in the past. But he says, that's nothing compared to what will happen for the nations. All the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow, and they will be as if they never were. So this is a massively important passage introducing us to the day of the Lord concept. Like we said, Edom becomes a harbinger of things to come for other nations. Think of Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage? The peoples plot in vain, set themselves against the Lord and his anointed. And so there's this idea of the nations coming against God, about his Messiah, his people. And so Edom is representative of that. And that's actually how the New Testament writers will understand this as well. Acts 15, understanding Edom to be representative of the nations. But here's what's important about this. When you have really the first time a concept is introduced in a major way, it becomes definitional for that concept. We mentioned this when we were talking about Joel 2 and repentance, because Joel is one of the early guys to really flesh out in a big way the nature of the repentance Israel needs to have. It becomes really definitional for how we understand repentance. I think the same could be said for this verse in the day of the Lord. And so we might ask, what can we learn from these verses about the day of the Lord, as it's just the basics of it are given to us. This is like Day of the Lord 101. Well, first, we might say that the day of the Lord is imminent. The day of the Lord is imminent. It's at hand. It is the idea. He says the day of the Lord draws near. It draws near. It is also international. It's on all the nations. And it is about indignation, right? It is, as you have done, it will be done to you. So God, it's about judgment. And it's talking about drinking this cup. And that concept is, in a lot of places, this cup of God's wrath that they'll be forced to drink. So it's God's indignation. And then I needed an I, and what do you know? Israel starts with I. So it is Israel's refining and restoration. So during this time of the day of the Lord, which isn't like one 24-hour day, it's like a period of time, it will include judgment on the nations, but Israel will be refined and judged to some degree, but then at the end of it, it will lead to their restoration. So those are really the principles that we get from Obadiah about the day of the Lord. That's actually quite a lot. And the other writers are going to fill in a lot of detail on that issue. Interestingly enough, in Isaiah 53, about the Messiah coming to bring judgment on the nations, we have a reference to Edom and Bozrah. And it says in Isaiah 63, 1-3, "Who is this who comes from Edom with garments of glowing colors from Bozrah? This one who is majestic in his clothing, marching in the greatness of his power. It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your clothing red, and your garments like the one who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the wine trough alone, and from the peoples there was no man with me. I also trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath, and their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments, and I stained all my clothes. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption has come." So you see that there's actually recompense and redemption kind of tied into this period, according to Isaiah. So
What was that reference?
that was Isaiah 63, 1-4. Since we have 1 minute here, I thought, this is actually pointed out to me recently. I don't think I caught this before, and I think I need to do a little more study on this as well. But a friend of mine pointed out a potential reference to the day of the Lord, though it's not quite called that, in Exodus. But just maybe a hint at it. Let's see, where are my notes here? Exodus 32, for whatever it's worth. Exodus 32, verse 34. This is after the golden calf incident. Exodus 32, 34, it says, "But now go," he's talking to Moses here, "guide the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I punish, I will punish them for their sin." So, in other words, he's saying, hey, Moses is saying, hey, if you don't forgive their sin, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book. In other words, like, Lord, he's pleading for the people. And so then it seems as though the Lord is pointing to this future day. In the day when I do punish, I will punish them for their sin. And of course, that gets built out later in the Bible as this time of Jacob's trouble, when God is punishing them and purifying them as well, like he did in the wilderness in Numbers. So anyway, interesting potential connection to the day of the Lord as well. Okay, so these nations are going to drink continually and swallow. They're going to have indignation. So this is the first comfort of judgment. It's the comfort of vengeance upon God's enemies. Then, verses 17 and 18, you have the comfort of victory for God's people. Comfort of victory for God's people. Verse 17, notice there's a contrasting word here, but. Right? So, but on Mount Zion, in contrast to the judgment there of the nations, but on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy. And the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble. And they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for Yahweh has spoken. Just a couple observations here. Notice Mount Zion, of course, that's Jerusalem. That's another title for that. There will be those who escape. Okay, so that idea of this remnant escaping, actually, we've seen this before in a couple places, but two of them are Isaiah 4. This was a eschatological passage that we saw, end time passage. Really great. In Isaiah 4, verse 3, it says, "It will be that he who remains in Zion and is left in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who's written down for life in Jerusalem." So this is looking at that final future day. And notice a lot of these same connections in Zion, those who are left, and the idea of holiness. They'll be called holy. So that's interesting. Joel also, we just studied Joel recently. So Joel chapter 2, verse 32 says this, "And it will be that," just before in verse 31, "before the great and awesome day of Yahweh comes. And it will be that everyone who calls in the name of Yahweh will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as Yahweh has said, even among the survivors whom Yahweh calls." Now, Joel says, "as Yahweh said," so you have to ask the question, where did he say it? Well, it can't be Isaiah, because Isaiah's too late for that, for Joel. So who else said this statement, that there will be survivors? Obadiah. So actually, this is one of our reasons why we might think that Obadiah is an earlier prophet writing, because Joel thinks that Yahweh said this somewhere, and Obadiah actually said it. It's almost the exact kind of language. So we were like, okay, Joel is borrowing from Obadiah, which puts him before, and so that kind of places him earlier. That's just a little how we get there, at least one way. So there's this idea of this remnant escaping, and there's holiness. So not only do they physically escape, but they spiritually, we might say, are cleansed. They're holy. It will be holy. Now you go, how do they get holy? Well, Obadiah doesn't tell us. He's not trying to fill in all the gaps. He's just giving you a big picture, like pocket, constitution. You can fit in your pocket. It's like just it's small. It's a panorama. And he's not giving you all the details. Of course, later prophets will tell us, how does Israel get holy? Well, through the Messiah, the suffering servant, and the new covenant, right? But he's not telling us that, but he's just giving us the framework. Others are going to build upon it. And another thing to notice here that's interesting, notice how he says in verse 18, "The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame." So Joseph likely would refer to the northern tribes, Jacob to the southern tribes. So he's referring to all Israel here. So some want to place this fulfillment as already having taken place, but there's too many markers here to say, well, no, this hasn't happened. There hasn't been a reunification of Israel again. And we've seen other prophets, of course, now that we're thinking Obadiah's early, other prophets who will talk about this as well, where the Messiah is going to bring together Israel and Judah and unite them again. So this has got to be future from our standpoint as well. And they're going to defeat their enemies, represented here as Esau. So they're going to have victory. They're going to have victory. There's going to be unity of northern and southern kingdom, and they're going to have victory over their enemies. So that's the next comfort. The comfort that God will judge their enemies, vengeance, and the comfort that they will have victory. And then there's the final section, verses 19 to 21, is the comfort of the kingdom. Now, if you were hoping for another V, it's impossible. If you find it, I'll give you $10, to complete this. But that's what this is about. It's the kingdom promises come to fruition. The comfort of the kingdom, verses 19 to 21. And I want you to notice the repetition. Can you notice the repetition? It's only 3 verses. What word keeps getting repeated? Just take a second and scan the text. Verses 19 to 21.
Possess.
Yes. Possess. It gets repeated many times. And that's really the issue here. This is the time when Israel will finally possess all the land that God intended for them to have in Israel. This is when the conquest, what were you going to say?
This is the future.
Yeah, in the future. So this is another indication of the future, that this is a future-looking prophecy from now, because you go like, when did they have all of this? And all that God promised them in the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 15. And this is a time when they actually will. Even in Joshua, when they're conquering the land, they divide and conquer. There are tough spots that they can't drive out all the people. The Philistines are a big nuisance to them and a problem. And though God gives them the land, there's still plenty of land that they don't fully possess, that God gave to them, but they didn't possess. And so now they're going to actually, you might say, complete the conquest that was unfinished under Joshua. And so they're going to get all these places. And so he lists all these different places that, hey, that spot that was super hard and you guys couldn't actually get it, you'll get it in the future. And then it's the end of exile too, because he says, the exiles, end of verse 20, the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad, that's pretty far away east. They will possess the cities of the Negev. So the exile's over, and be brought back. They're going to possess the land that God wanted for you to have. And so Israel gets their land, right? And so we see this idea of possession, and this is connected to the idea of the kingdom. So exile's over, conquest completed, culmination of all of God's covenant promises and every aspect of them, every detail. And then you have this culminating verse, verse 21, and the saviors will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will belong to Yahweh. So we've got a few things here. You're like, all right, what's going on here? All right, we've got these characters, the saviors, and they're going to ascend Mount Zion. That's Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem plays a big role. And they're going to have a judging role. That idea of judging may be the idea of like ruling or administering. And they're going to do it on the mountain. They'll judge the mountain of Esau. Remember, already Esau's been now stand-in for the nations. They're representative of the nations. And this is the time when the kingdom belongs to Yahweh. So, okay, couple things here. You remember in Isaiah 2, 1-4, Micah 4, 1-4. So Isaiah 2, Micah 4. Both these passages talk about Jerusalem being lifted up as the highest of the mountains, right? So there's topographical changes. And the nations stream to Jerusalem. People go up to Jerusalem during this time. So that seems to be, that's this time period. The time period in the kingdom of Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, when people are ascending Mount Zion. They're coming up for the law of the Lord. And here's these characters, the saviors. And it's a similar term that's used. Actually, there's two terms used in the book of Judges, that God raises up these characters to administer and rule and have a function among his people. But I think this idea of the saviors here is really God is going to give rulership to his people in the kingdom to rule over aspects of the creation from Jerusalem and out from there over the nations. I mean, we have passages like Revelation 5, 9-10. They will reign over the earth. Speaking of the saints, in Revelation 20, verse 4, thrones were set up from which the saints will rule. So we rule with Christ. In Daniel's prophecy, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 27, we read this. It says, "Then the reign, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions will serve and obey him." So it's given to the people. So the Messiah reigns, yes, but he also administers and delegates that authority to others. Paul says, that we will reign with him, and I think it's in 2 Timothy 2. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2, Paul talks about, don't you know that you will judge angels? You'll have this rulership idea, the administration idea, and you're like, what is that going to involve? But there's multiple references in the scriptures to this ruling, exercising authority of the redeemed in the future kingdom. And so I think that seems to be what these saviors refer to as they have this administration. This may refer most specifically to people among Israel, but of course that is expanded for the saints in the church as well. Those we will rule and reign with Christ on this new earth in the kingdom, having areas of responsibility before the Lord. And to judge the mountain of Esau, which is probably judge the nations, judge the different parts of the world and the administrations. And this is the time when the kingdom belongs to the Lord. Now, a couple cross references here, and we'll wrap it up with this. This last phrase, the kingdom will belong to Yahweh. This comes up a number of times, but a couple significant ones is Psalm 22. Psalm 22, this should tip you off because this is the psalm, messianic psalm about the Messiah's suffering. The first half of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me, is about how Messiah suffers, right? But then there's a shift in the middle where he is victorious. So it says, verse 19, but you, O Yahweh, will not be far off. O my strength, hasten to my help. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion, from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. And so he's asking for all these things. And he says, you have answered me. And then it shifts. Verse 22, I will surely recount your name to my brothers. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. So he's like, whoa. He's like, he died, but now here he is proclaiming the name in the assembly. So he's alive again. And then notice verse 27. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to Yahweh, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is Yahweh's, and he rules over the nations. So what the Messiah does in dying and being victorious is he redeems a people for himself among all the nations. And he will then establish his kingdom and rule over the earth. And there'll be all these nations there. And that seems to be what Obadiah, in very bite-sized form, is highlighting for us here, that when the kingdom belongs to the Lord, when all these things take place. Another is in Zechariah chapter 14, last chapter of Zechariah, just a few books forward. This is context is the second coming of Jesus the Messiah. And in Zechariah 14, verse 9, it says, and Yahweh will be king over all the earth. In that day, Yahweh will be the only one, and his name one. And then, of course, in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, this language comes up again. In chapter 11, verse 15, it says, then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. And so this idea from Obadiah is picked up in a number of places. This is the culmination. This is the comfort that after judgment comes the kingdom. God establishes it, and his people, the Saviors, rule over the nations, the world, from Mount Zion, from Jerusalem, and the Lord is king over all. So, certainty of judgment, verses 1 to 9, cause of judgment, 10 to 14, comforts of judgment, 15 to 21. So God will bring down the proud and self-secure. God's judgment of the wicked and those who do his people harm will be judged, and it will be a comfort to God's people. God promises a kingdom that is sure to come. And really, if you just want a brief survey, a brief panorama, pocket, guide for all that God's going to do from the initial battle between Jacob and Esau, how that functions through history, and how that relates to what God's going to do ultimately to end history or this age, you got it all in Obadiah. It's a panorama, just brief details to give you the big picture as a comfort to say, Israel, the kingdom's coming. I will judge your enemies. Take comfort and have peace in light of that. We might end by saying, how do you solve the issue of world peace? Well, you solve it by solving the problem between Israel and Edom. When the bitter battle between brothers is solved, then you solve the problem for the world, and God's kingdom comes. So there's Obadiah. All right, we did it.
Yeah, so when they talk about peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about.
When Christ comes to reign and rule, that's what
Well, that's is that about